The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guest are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show.
I first met him back in 1972 when I was just graduating from high school and starting college. He was the mentor for the Pan-African Student Union. Through his guidance, we overtook the student government in 1974. Dr. Oba, Brother Tashaka, is a visionary. He's a scholar. He is a prolific author. He's written several texts. He's written The Legacy of Malcolm X, so that's very befitting for him to be our speaker tonight. He's also written The Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, and Male-Female Equality, Return to the Mother Principle of Male-Female Equality. He also has a new book that will be released soon, and it's called The 12 Creators of Egyptian and World Civilization. The first chapter in that book is Back to Black, Bridging the Generation Gap. Brother Tashaka is a full professor at San Francisco State University. He's fully tenured. He was a former chairperson. He's the founder and the chairperson for the Pan-African People's Organization. He's someone we truly love and respect. And I really appreciate him. I'd like him to come forward. We have a plaque to present for him. Would you all like to join me in giving him a new African welcome? On behalf of the New African People's Organization and the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. The plaque reads, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement presents the Malcolm X Self-Determination Award to Dr. Oba Tashaka for outstanding service in the spirit of Kuji Chakalia, February 22nd, 2003.
Hotep. How's everybody doing? I want to say that it's really an honor to be here, to have a chance to share some ideas with you on this 12th commemorative banquet for El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. Many of us here are sons and daughters of him. When El Hajj Malik El Shabazz died, I cried more than when my father died, because my father died at 77 years of age. He was struck down at the prime of his life. When he died, we lost the best of our leadership and the best of our thought, but his spirit lives on. So we're here to pay acknowledgement to him. I want to say to my buddy, Dr. Asa Hilliard, who's here, you ought to give him a hand. This is a brother who speaks more around the country than he probably can keep track of. And he took the time out of his busy schedule after his airplane was delayed and stalled out of the Atlanta airport to come here, to be here tonight. And this is a brother who has backed me. When I went up for tenure, they ran a counterintelligence program on me, as they've done 3 times to try and take my life. I fought him. Dr. Hilliard was in charge of my tenure committee. And there was a time where I was ready to really dig in and really get ready to fight. And Asa pulled me to the side and he said, "Brother, you need to stop fighting. You've already won." That's Brother Asa for you. I want to say to the Malcolm X Committee, the Grassroots movement, the African People's Party, the forerunners of them, the Revolutionary Action Movement. Some of you may not know about RAM. That was the most conscious of the organizations we had in the 60s, who sent us out a lot of literature on the Black liberation movement and helped wake us, a whole lot of us up. So to see them continue to do this work is inspiring. So I'm really honored to be here. My presentation this evening is entitled African American Culture, a culture, not a subculture. You hear me? A culture, not a subculture. We're in a very serious time right now. We see that a right-wing administration was put into office by the Supreme Court. Not elected, but selected. And we see that this right-wing administration is carrying out an agenda that reflects the Western worldview. And this agenda is Iraq today, the Middle East tomorrow, and us at the same time. And we see that at the same time the world has mobilized an opposition against this right-wing Ku Klux Klan redneck administration. And they find themselves in isolation. But you know, this president, who hasn't studied the authors of his worldview, but who consistently follows it, said that he doesn't view millions of people in his homeland, Europe, and millions of his people in America standing up against this war as anything more than a group of people who are just tested for political poll. But we have to say that we regard an attack against Iraq as the same as an attack against our people, because we know that the same forces that will attack them have been consistently attacking us for the last 400 years. We know that September 11th was used as a justification to carry out what I call crypto-fascism. Because what you're seeing is the emergence of fascism in this country. There was a white author in the 60s who said that white Americans would probably give up their freedom in the name of security. And what you see is that these whites in the White House, with their Negro Oreo cookie advisors, have used September the 11th as an excuse, they say, to protect Americans against terrorism by terrorizing the American population with the Patriot Act and Homeland Security, and now Patriot Act 2, that has virtually eviscerated the Bill of Rights. We need to understand that there is no way in the world you can justify standing up to what you call an attack against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon as a war, when in fact there's no army that attacked this country. So we're saying that we need to stand up and organize and continue to organize against the terrorist attacks that this government has carried out against us. Because for over 400 years, there's been a systematic terroristic attack against African people in this country. Most importantly, the most serious part of this attack has occurred since 1968. I really want to stress this because while slavery was more dehumanizing than what's happened to us since the post-60s, what's happened to us since the post-60s is far more sophisticated, far more subtle, and therefore has been far more devastating to our rich culture. What am I referring to? Hostile, powerful external forces arrayed themselves against us no sooner than El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz was barely in his grave before they assassinated Brother Martin Luther King, in the form of drugs that were put into our community. Drugs brought in by the CIA, in the form of redevelopment programs that systematically broke up black communities and destroyed black businesses. The drugs that came into our community drove a wedge between the youth and the elders and helped erode our rich extended family community. You hear me? We have seen unrestrained violence in our community. One of my students was telling me last Wednesday, a street dude with his head wrapped on and everything else, a conscious brother who comes out of a war zone to go to class, and he told me that in Richmond, the police come in and drop boxes full of M16s and 357 magnums, boxes full. And you wonder why there's so much violence in our communities. So our communities have been hit by foster care, which has taken young black children and warehoused them and put them into a new slave trade, where most of the parents that they're getting, foster parents, are getting $35,000 a year, in most cases, to abuse them. Am I telling the truth? And so what you're seeing is young black children who are being moved from one household to the other, never experiencing love. And so now we have a love deficit in African American communities, and we have some young people who are coming up now who have received no love, and since they've received none, they don't know how to give in. You hear me? These and many other powerful external forces, as I noted in my book, The Mother Principle, has created a phenomenon that we don't really understand because we're too close to it. It has put us in the position of choosing between two cultures. You hear me? Many of us have stepped outside of our culture. And my main theme tonight is going to be on how we reconstructed culture and slavery, because we better go back to black to bridge all the gaps that are messing us up. In fact, we better go black to the future, as the rap artist said. Isn't that right? But the fact is that these powerful external forces have put us in a position where we've been organizing in the Fillmore now as a part of a pilot project to spread across this country to strengthen extended family communities. And if I ask you what is the most pressing problem in the African American community today, most of you wouldn't get it. The youth would in most cases, but most of the adults would not get it, and the reason is we're too close to it. We would say it's economics, we would say it's violence, disrespect, a whole lot of things, disrespect towards women and all these things. But what we've observed, and this is a new phenomenon, and this is an indication that something seriously is wrong in our communities and we need to address it, is that we've gone door to door, we found that the central problem, and I will tell you it's a problem in Atlanta, it's a problem in Oakland, it's a problem in Chicago, across this country. This is something that white people used to have as a problem before, and we didn't have it as a problem. It's the generation gap. I want you to really hear this, because as we go door to door, this is no scientific study, we've been talking to folks. And what we find is that older people in the community tend to define their problems in terms of young people. And young people tend to say that it's older people who are not paying attention to them, not passing on history to them, not passing on leadership to them. And let me give you the indicator of how serious this is. There's a great book that's come out called I've Got the Light of Freedom. It's a classic work on the struggle of Mississippi activists. The bile of Mississippi, everyday black folk. And you know what the author concludes? He says that black activists in Mississippi, those who came out of the struggles of the 60s, are no longer passing the activist traditions on to their children. Hear what I'm telling you? I ain't coming in here to pat you on the head. I'm coming in here to tell the truth, because you should know the truth, and the truth can set you free if you act on it. You know what I'm telling you? So that what we have to do is literally construct strategies to bridge the generation gap. We also have to construct strategies to bridge the amnesia gap, because y'all know we suffer from historical amnesia. And we're about the only people on the planet that's satisfied with being amnesiacs. You know what I mean? The only people who don't want to know about their history. Because we've been given such a false bill of goods on what's wrong with Africa, how savage Africa was, and it's led many of us to say, I don't want anything to do with Africa. When my students take black studies, many of their parents have said, what you taking that black mess for? And if yes, today. You understand? So that we need to heal the male-female relationship gap. You know what I'm talking about? The one in which sisters is looking for a good brother. They're wondering, where is he? He's in prison, and many of them have been priced out of the job market because those runaway shops took the blue-collar workers away, and as a result, those were the jobs that everyday black men could use to support families. And so now we see in our communities, gangsterism and hoodism has replaced extended family communityism. So we don't call our neighborhoods neighborhoods anymore, they're hoods. We don't talk about elders anymore, they're OGs. Because what's happened with this displacement of work in the black community and with the rise of the prison industrial complex, which is the new prison, we find many of our best men incarcerated. So what I want to stress here is this, that if we're to heal all these gaps, we got to start valuing the thing that's most important to us. The thing most important to us is not how much money we got. It's not how many cars we got. It's not how big our house is. It's not what's in the bank. It's not the clothes and the rags that we wear, because you know we know how to wear some good rags. You know what I mean? The most valuable thing that we have to preserve, respect, and maintain, and in this case protect, is our rich African and African American culture. Yeah. The basis for bridging the gap between the generations is culture, because even though some people in my age will put down hip hop, as one of my best students, Ricky Vincent, who wrote a classic work called Funk, it's been translated in at least 4 languages, he said, hip hop is nothing more than a renaissance of funk. You hear me? Hip hop is based on the premise of African culture, the funky word, as the hip hoppers say, word up. Isn't that right? So the bridge is the popular culture, the blues. I come out of the rhythm and blues generation. The generation before me was the bebop generation. And the generation before that was the swing generation. And guess what? All those generations are drawn from a rich African culture. That is the basis for healing our people. The greatest leader in the 20th century, as much as I love Brother Malik El-Shabazz, he was the best mind we produced in this country, and one of the 2 best organizers, Ella Baker being the 3rd. You hear me? Need to give her respect. But the greatest leader in the 20th century was a little-known brother, Amilcar Cabral. Master thinker, master organizer. And what did he say? He said, liberation's an act of culture. So we got to understand that every time our people have moved for liberation, it has been our culture that gave us our inspiration. Frederick Douglass said he didn't learn to hate slavery until he heard the moaning sounds and the beautiful sounds of the spirituals. Soon I'll be done with the troubles of this world, going home to live with God. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. It is this culture that has nourished us. Cabral also made this comment. He said that if we are to draw from our culture correctly, we've got to study it, but we have to internalize it. He called it mental conversion. Because you may not know this, Cabral came out of Cape Verde, and Cape Verdeans were assimilated. They thought they were Portuguese, just like a lot of us think we're Americans. You understand? He formed a study group. You know, like these African-centered study groups we got now. You understand? And he said in them, we decided to be African. Isn't that funny? An African deciding to be African. But we know that's not funny because we have to make the same decision. And he said he underwent mental conversion. Malcolm X said he underwent philosophical change, attitude change, thought change, and behavior change. And so literally, we need to mine, M-I-N-E, the best of African and African-American culture and internalize it. It's not enough to read your culture. You gotta digest it like good food. You know what I'm talking about? It's gotta be a part of your diet because then it will make you healthy. But Cabral also said something else. He said the awakening is not complete. Studying is not sufficient but necessary until you join the people in a struggle for liberation. You hear me? I can affirm that. In 1960, I was a student at San Francisco State University, brainwashed, government major. 61 in law school. In the civil rights movement in 1960, Congress of Racial Equality. It took an everyday black person by the name of Norman Brown who drove a cab to give me my first lessons in political education, to teach me the nature of American democracy. It took everyday black people to wake most of us up. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture said, it was everyday black people who taught him to love himself in the bowels of Mississippi. You hear me? Our awakening isn't just studying our history, it's returning to our people who are the makers and shapers of our history, but most important, who have shaped this beautiful culture. The spirituals, the blues, rhythm and blues, jazz, hip-hop, all of them. R&B was shaped by everyday black folks whose names you don't know. Our churches were built by everyday black folks, most of whose names you don't know. And many of our best leaders had less than an 8th grade education because the less white education you are, usually, the more intelligent you are. So you see, I never think I know more than the people. Because the people are the ones who educated me. In fact, the baddest black man I ever knew was my father, a little 5'6" black man who was rearing his foot behind Ku Klux Klansmen in Orange, Texas when he was 11 years old. You hear me? A lot of us have black men and women like that in our families. Isn't that the truth? They're the expressions of our family cultural history. So we've got to draw from the best of our past, we've got to internalize it, and we've got to join our people in struggle at the same time. But here's the thing, because my theme tonight is African American culture, a culture, not a subculture. See, many of us have not valued this culture. You know what I'm telling you? Many of us have not. Many of us have not taken the time to systematically study it. For example, if you want to know African American philosophy, study African American music. Because the deepest part is in jazz. If you want to look at the deepest philosophers we have in African American culture, study Dizzy Gillespie, to be or not to buy. Study John Coltrane. Study, even though Miles had his problems, Miles Davis. There were some things he didn't get together, but he sure was creative. We have not, as a people, systematically taken our culture and looked at it and asked ourselves what's good about it and what isn't. What do we need to keep and what do we need to discard? As a result, when those powerful forces hit us in the post-60s, our culture began to unravel quicker than at any point in our people's history because there was a residual of slavery. And that residual of slavery said that if it was white, it was right. If it was white, it was better. We've got to value this culture. That means we have to study African American culture as carefully as we study African culture. Because I'm talking to the Africanists in here. With the Negroes, I got to tell them to study both. But you're all into Africa, so you all need to look at this African American thing more because that's how we apply Africa to our reality. You know what I mean? So the thing is, we have to understand something. Many of our scholars have bought into the idea that we are either a subculture or that we have African carryovers. About the strongest most of our scholars have done is with African carryovers. Now, the argument that we're a subculture has been based on the assumption that our culture was wiped out during slavery. And we even hear nationalists say this. They'll say they destroyed our culture in slavery. We even say this. Am I telling the truth? We'll say they wiped out our language, they wiped out our religion. You know, we couldn't practice our lineage systems, they wiped our culture out. But this is the thing to understand about culture. African American culture is our way of life and our design for living. Like African culture, it's spirit and word-based. It's what picks us up in the morning and carries us through the day. If you're of my generation, you can't get along too long without some Aretha Franklin. My former student, Sonyika, Haiba, who's a bad sister, you ought to give her a hand, you know, dedicated. She saw that I had my Walkman on today, because when I work out, I put the Walkman on, because I can beat the machines if I got Aretha or James Cleveland. She said, "What you listening to, jazz?" I said, "No, I'm listening to some gospel music." Because that's the most African part of us. Jazz is too, but it's the most African part of us. So we got to understand something, that there's been this belief that our culture was wiped out. Most of us believe it. But let me tell you something. If your formal vestige of your language is wiped out, guess what? Language is nothing but a shell of a thought pattern. The question is whether or not the thought pattern was wiped out. You hear me? They can wipe out your drums, but we know what black people did. We made the body a drum. Gospel music is the only form of polyrhythmic music we've had until bebop came along, because every other part was monorhythmic, because we were able to turn our whole body and our voice into a drum. Am I telling the truth? You hear me? So there's something about culture that's deep, it's subliminal. It's inside of you. In fact, I'd say you can take the African out of Africa, but you can't take Africa out of the African. Isn't that right? Even the African who don't want nothing to do with Africa, when he gets on the dance floor, what do? Their hips start to swing in the direction of Africa. Even when that brainwashed brother brings a white girl home, you understand? In the end, when it comes to marrying somebody, she ends up looking like his mom. Because 97% of our men and women marry each other. You all do know that, don't you? Yes. So there's something subliminal in this. But you got to understand something. The school of thought that argues that our culture's African carryovers, that's been the strongest argument that black scholars have put forward, and they've been following behind a white scholar called Melvin Herskovitz, a book called Myth of the Negro Past. Some of you here have read it. Nice little book on African scraps. How we had a little scrap of culture here and a little scrap of culture there. And so that's about as far as we go on it. Here's the point about cultural scraps. If all you got is scraps for a diet, it's not nutritious. And if all you have is scraps for a cultural diet, it will not feed you, and you'll end up eating the main meal who's provided by somebody else. And you know you don't like how white people cook. So the thing is, E. Franklin Fraser was a foremost proponent of the integrationist school that slavery destroyed our culture. And he was never threatened by Melvin Herskovitz because he knew cultural scraps affirmed his position. That if that's all you could say about African American culture, we have scraps of culture, then he's proved his point. And he was right. But I'm here to tell you something. African American culture is founded on the fundamental premises of African culture. You hear me? With European influences. I'm not about to deny the damage that slavery did. I'm not to deny the historical amnesia. I'm not to deny the fact that some of us are less likely to be struck by lightning than to be color struck. You know what I'm talking about? Y'all know what I'm talking about. That's that slave syndrome of the house slave. Some of us have the mentality that we love the master more than the master loved himself. Malcolm talked about that. That's why Colin Powell could oppose this war, but when he lost, he wanted to be a team player. Because he identified with the White House. He didn't want to be shut out of the White House. Hell, if somebody's about to destroy people and it's wrong, burn the house down. At least get out of the house. Team player, nothing. So the thing is, we got to understand that this argument of a subculture is weak, but our culture is based on the fundamental premises of African culture. Now, Cabral said something else, and this is very important, because I'm going to give you the facts. Cabral said something else. He said, you measure a people's chance for achieving liberation by how different their culture is from the culture of the oppressor. And I would add to this that it is a question of how qualitatively more just your culture is than that of your oppressor. It's a qualitative question of how much more truthful is your culture than that of the oppressor. It's a question of how much more free is your culture, if his culture can be free at all. That's one of the illusions that too many Negroes have. And so, I'm going to give you facts. See, the argument that says we lost our culture in slavery is premised on this, and many of us buy it, that we became Christians, and a part of becoming Christians, we lost our culture. St. Clair Drake argued it best. He said, African culture in the Caribbean and South America is Afro-American. He said it's a culture, but in here it's a subculture, because we underwent more Christianization than any other Africans in the Western Hemisphere. That's the basic argument. So a lot of others, I don't have time to go into them. I'll deal with the hardest part. Now guess what? Those who have argued that position never gave you any facts to support that. Like data on how many blacks were Christians during slavery. But our great historian, W.B. Du Bois, greatest scholar produced in the 20th century in the United States. I didn't say black scholar, greatest scholar. Looked them all. He did his study and he showed that in 1859, there were 8.3 million Africans in the South, enslaved. But there were only 460,000 Africans who were Christians. Uh-oh. What does that mean? For 250 years, there was no systematic conversion of black people to Christianity. And what did that mean? That for 240 years, African culture prevailed on virtually every plantation in this country. You hear me? In fact, what's ironic, we were more African in slavery than we are right now. Ain't that a shame? Zora Neale Hurston, with her bad self, she said, it seems the further we get from slavery and the more we get around white people, it seems the whiter we get. See what I mean? We need to go back to black, black to the future. And so, what was it that enabled us to maintain this great culture? We got to look at the difference between our culture and the European culture. European culture and Euro-American culture is fundamentally a despiritualized culture. Y'all understand that? While George Bush may talk about God, he's a Holy Ghost, well not a Holy Ghost Christian, but he's a born-again Christian. You know what I mean? Right-wing Christian. He's going to bring God to the whole world. Save us from those kind of Christians. But the fact is that if you look at the European, he took spirit out of every dimension of life. Adam Smith took spirit out of economy. John Locke took spirit out of politics. Every major thinker, Karl Marx, took spirit out of economics, and his was a radical interpretation, so he thought. And so, I mean, if we look at Western thinkers, Hegel took spirit out of his thoughts. And what do you see? Therefore, the European has reduced the universe to a material equation. Everything is matter. Paul Robeson, one of our greatest thinkers, he made this observation. You know, he was a multidimensional genius. He said somewhere around the Renaissance, but he said, I think it occurred early, and he's right, it occurred a lot earlier. He said, Western man began to deify reason so much that they stripped their thought of any kind of intuition. And he said they reached a point where they could no longer really determine what was true. And he said as a result, Europeans have been incapable of producing great art or great music. In fact, the European has so rationalized everything that Hegel created this notion that God was reason. You hear me? And so what we see, and a lot of us see, this is heavy stuff because we think, well, what's wrong with reason? Nothing wrong with reason. It's just when you strip it of intuition. It's just when you strip it of spirit. As a result, when you see the earth as nothing more but as inanimate matter, you can conquer it and control it. You hear me? And this has been the project of Western man. They have become so mechanical with their thinking that they can't even dance. You know what they call ballet? Ballet is nothing but mental gymnastics. White people skipping around on their toes defying the law of gravity. And we know that dance is supposed to be a form of communication, never done the same way twice. Am I telling the truth? Now you may say I'm not being objective, that I should treat these Europeans better. People who have faced what we face, we're doing good to talk about them at all. My book, The Mother Principle, has only one small chapter on them, and it's the only chapter that doesn't have any illustrations because I couldn't think of anything beautiful to preface the European worldview. You hear me? You need to understand something else. America is an extension of Europe. That is, its political economy. And if you think that our culture collapsed under this Euro-American because he was so bad, then you explain this to me. How is it that when it comes to the politics and the economy of this country, the only original thing is that there's nothing original? Their politics is John Locke and Montesquieu. Their economics is Adam Smith. It all is an import of Europe. The only thing original is African American and Native American culture. So my brothers and sisters, what is African culture based on? The creators of African culture are little acknowledged and little known. They are these little people called the Chwa. Mitochondrial DNA traces them back 160,000 years ago to two ethnic groups, one the San people of Kum in the Kalahari Desert, and the Chwa. Both Chwa. Europeans incorrectly call them pygmies. And guess what? These little people are the authors of the notion of God. Uh-oh. Now you know we're entering some serious terrain here. Now what I really want to say is, their idea of God, because you know black people, we ain't just into God, we're into God. God is serious with us. And I know I'm in the South, you don't mess with God. You hear me? White people think they're God, but we know better. These little people, their concept of God was really the construct for the greatest civilizations that African people built, in which, by the way, they founded ancient Kemet and Nubia. It was this concept of God that, unlike Christianity, is inconsistent with science. Their concept of God is a spirit science. It is perfectly consistent with modern-day quantum physics. You hear me? Dr. P.A.P.O, who chairs our department, he said, Western physics has reached a dead end for the Western world because that's their biggest thing, but they have no theory to explain it. Because they've materialized the universe so much that now they've entered the invisible realm and they have no kind of theory to explain the invisible. But you know what these Chwa say, these little tiny people? They say God is vital force. Hear me? They say it is the vital force of God that is the energy that gives life to the entire universe. They say it is the vital force of God through which man and woman and all his creatures can achieve perfection. Ain't this heaven? The Bambara, who also have a connection with these Chwa, but you know, they lay the foundation for this spirit science for Africans. They say God is infinite force outside of space and outside of time. You hear me? If that isn't quantum physics, I don't know what it is. Except quantum physics doesn't know that the greatest physicists in the universe, the greatest scientists in the universe, the greatest artist in the universe, the greatest mathematician in the universe is God. You hear me? Africans understand that. You hear me? If you look at these ancient Kemites, they drew from this spirit science. And if you look at their account of the noon, it is perfectly consistent with this idea of God as vital force, because it is the idea that this watery matter is atomic energy. This watery matter is particles and waves, and out of which comes the creator. So what we see here is that these 12 are the authors not only of God, but of one God, but not monotheistic killer cults. Because in the name of one God, too many people have been killed. Too many people have been put in slavery. These are not a people who try and convert anybody, because while you may say they gave birth to religion, in truth, it was a spirit system, because there's no word in any African language for religion. You hear what I'm telling you? Nor in Native American languages either. And so, why is this important? This notion of spirit, which is also the secret to why these 12 are considered the most just people on the planet. They have no murderers among them, no rapists among them. You understand? None who have committed any serious kinds of crimes. That's why to this day, even a white historian by the name of Basil Davidson said that the African is still the most moral person on the planet, and I would add, as messed up as we are. Because we have such a high standard to draw from. These little tiny people. It is from the little that the great comes. It's from the seed that life comes. It's God who is no thing but everything. So what does this have to do with African American culture? Because the European culture is despiritualized. Spirit's not in it. In fact, for them, it's a spooky idea, spirit. Africans say matter's real. But more real is non-matter, is spirit, because the source of matter is spirit. So in slavery, it was the African priest who came to the Americas, who was the key instrument in African culture. W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to FIS, because he had come from a white community, so it was his real first experience being among blacks. And during the summer, he would travel in the rural areas, and he loved black folks. He wrote this classic work called The Souls of Black Folks. And what he observed was this. He said, these Africans aren't practicing Christianity. He said, they're practicing a form of voodoo. The Afrocentric psychologists call it the voodoo in the black IQ. You'd be surprised how much voodoo is in you. You want to know? So he made this intuitive statement. He didn't do the research to back it up, but he was absolutely correct. He said that it was the institution of the African priesthood and the African healer that was the main institution. He said the sole institution that Africans brought to America. I would disagree. It wasn't the sole one. We took lineages, turned them into extended families. We had folk tales. We had music. There were a host of other things. But he was right. It was the principal institution. And he said this. On the plantation, it was the African priest who was the one who could tell a slave about the unknown. He was the one who could heal the sick. He was the one who could bring vengeance down on those who oppressed the slave. And he was the natural leader in the slave community. Now I've done my research. And when you check the research out, on every plantation, there were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Babalaos, or whatever they call it. In the Yoruba system, that means father of mysteries. And increasingly sisters, because in the Western Hemisphere, more and more sisters became priestess. You understand? Than on the continent. Even though you had priestess on the continent, more in the Western Hemisphere. And what was their role? Anytime an African had a problem, he went to his priest for what? He wanted to know whether or not, this is a very practical question, he'd get whipped. Ain't that practical? And so the priest would divine. And if the priest said, yes, a whipping is coming, his job was to protect you from that whipping. A lot of you now become Western educated. You say, how could he protect you from a whipping? But if somebody tells you that they're from Louisiana and they deal with this voodoo, and a lot of you say you're not in it, you hear me? in practice. You hear me? And chances are they were a part of it.
That's right.
And so, in one slave narrative, a slave is whipped. And every time that slave is whipped, the slave master's wife was whipped. And when he went home, she was drenched in blood. You'll say that's not possible. I've been in this Odoifa system for 20 years, and what I can tell you about this divination system is I've never seen it to be wrong. Never. Divination is a cultural unity. One of the reasons why our culture could survive the attack of European culture is that even though we came from different ethnic groups, we had common practices, and the most common practice was the African priesthood. And the most common practice for the priest was divining. You hear me? Some of us need divination because divination just tells you who you are. It's called your destiny. In ancient Kemet, they called it your call. You know, many of us today walking around, some of us who know we're African don't know what our destiny is. And most of us don't know that we're African and don't know what our African destiny is. And every one of us are here with a purpose, with gifts. This African priest was the one that gave us courage to stand up and fight. We know about it in Haiti. We know that when Bookman came together, Bookman said, throw away the gods of the Christians, for they oppress you. Pick up the gods of Africa. But we often don't look at why the slave revolts that were so successful were. Look at Denmark, Bessie's rebellion. Bessie was bad, but he had a cat underneath him who was even better. His name was Gula Jack. He was an Angola priest, hoodoo man, voodoo man. He was so good that he could take the governor of South Carolina's house Negroes, more trusted than a poodle. And when he got through with them, they were prepared to poison him. He was so bad that he gave him medicine, and he told him, take this medicine and no bullets will ever penetrate your body. And he said, realize I represent the gods of Africa. If you betray me, all of heaven will fall down upon you. You hear me? This African freedom fighter, he had a sense of some kind of fearlessness because he had a sense of his own spiritual context. And it was this African priest. This African priest, read the slave narratives. The average one is the slaves interviewed are 96, 98, 120, 128 years old. Y'all read those slave narratives? Slaves will say, we lived a long time back then. You know why? Because as Du Bois said, the African priest was a healer. That's right. When slaves got sick, you might not think this, but some masters actually did send their doctors because it was kind of like a horse getting sick. Right. You know what I mean? It was their investment. And so when they brought their medicine in, the slave would take the medicine and say, yes, thank you, and they'd leave and throw it out the window. And they call on that voodoo priest to heal them. You hear me? And these voodoo priests were so good at healing that a lot of whites came for healing. I'm here to tell you today that we need some of that kind of healing right now. You hear me? Because we got kids getting sugar diabetes at 16 and 17 years old. Our diets are being shaped by fast food and grease. But these Babalaos understood herbs. They understood enemas. They understood how to clean your system out, how to be healthy. And our grandparents have this knowledge. You know the oatmeal medicine. Eat oatmeal rather than cereal. Some of us have been so sick of oatmeal, we don't want to eat it. But guess what? There's no cholesterol in it. I put honey on it, I put bananas on it because it's nasty tasting, but I eat it because my grandmother knew what she was talking about. You know you don't want to take that castor oil, but you know you need to clean yourself out. So this priest kept us healthy. But most important, and this is very serious, the African priest helped us create the hush harbors and the praise houses. And the hush harbors was where we stuck away at night, in the forest, in the swamps, or in another slave's house. And we put our heads under a pot and we hushed prayers to God. You hear me? This was the institution of African spirit practices where we came together because we were sick of this white preacher who came on the plantation singing, slaves, don't steal your master's hogs. Slaves, don't steal your master's chickens. Read the slave narratives. They'll tell you that's all the preaching they got. And then they'd say, follow the Pauline epistles, slave, obey your master. Most slaves would never read the Pauline epistles. They would have nothing to do with it. But the most important thing that the hush harbors did and the praise houses did was that preacher man, that priest, would bring down the Spirit and it would possess the congregation. And this is the most important part of the African American so-called religious experience, is that it is rooted in spirit. Am I telling the truth? Hear me? You gotta understand how important this is, because I'm making a difficult argument, because we got a whole lot. I know I'm in the South. A lot of Christians, you know what I mean? But there's a fundamental difference between true African-American Christianity and white Christianity, and the fundamental dividing line is this. Christianity is the only religion, Western Christianity, that separates God from what he creates. And by the way, he's he in their religion. And therefore, God's external to man. God's external to nature. In fact, the Bible says man is given the power to control nature. I don't believe God said that. I believe the Hebrews said that. I believe that that was a part of their nomadic conquest mentality. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the black church experience, it is rooted in spirit, and it is rooted in spirit being a part of you. Martin Luther King, in the early period of the Montgomery bus boycott, was hesitant, he was scared, and he wasn't sure if he would continue on. And then he said, I sat in my kitchen one night, and he said, the Spirit of God visited me. And ever since then, I've had fear no more. When you go into a true sanctified black church, you go into a true Baptist church, a true holiness church, not one of these sedity, middle-class Negro churches, where the preacher can't preach, where there's no gravy on the sermon, where they put you to sleep, where the choir is singing in straight notes. But if you go into one of these that's truly African, what is the whole service about? It's about bringing down the Spirit. Am I telling the truth? The preacher's sermon isn't a cadence that is designed to hypnotize you. Gospel music itself is designed to be gospel, to put a spell upon you. And so spirit is the fundamental thing about our experience. I'm going to tell you something else. Most black people ain't read the Bible, but black people know about the Spirit. And it's this Holy Ghost that has been the mechanism for hiding African spirit. So I'm here to tell you, African American culture is fundamentally spirit-based, and it's why we came out of slavery whole. Yes. Because we had the sense of God in us. We should have come out as hateful people and avenging people, but we came out as humane people, and that is truly beautiful. You hear me? So if we're going to compare the difference between our culture and their culture, because your chance for achieving liberation is how qualitatively different it is, then we got to understand that their culture is also one based on reason being separate from emotion. And ours is based on a word-based. Zora Neale Hurston said this. Most of you haven't heard this. This is a real heavy observation. Hieroglyphic mentality. That's right. What does this mean? Western culture is a written culture. Everything's in writing. Everything they do has got to go according to a written script. I used to play baseball. Coaches like to tell you what pitches to throw. If you watch football now, the coach has got the earphones on the quarterback telling him what passes to throw. You understand? Everything's scripted out. Their dance is scripted out. You can bet the war plan for Iraq has got any number of scripts for it. You understand? But Africans come out of a different culture. It's a word-based culture. Though we gave birth to writing, our writing, as Dr. Carruthers calls it, is authoritative utterance, metadata. You understand? Meaning that our writing imitates our speech. It's authoritative utterance. It's like we're speaking. We have what we call orality in the literature. When black writers write, they usually write the way they speak. Is that right? Because it's the word thing for us. When a black musician plays a saxophone, John Coltrane, he will go to a sanctified church and hear that preacher say, amen, and come back and squeak it out on his saxophone. Because the instrument that we play is designed to reproduce the human voice. And let me tell you something. I don't think there's too many singers that can do better than Aretha Franklin. But when one of the best singers in the history of the world can say that her singing is modeled after her father's preaching, then you know you're in a different kind of culture. It be truly, as the hip-hop and rap artists say, a word up culture. The word is everything for us. But Zora said we have this hieroglyphic mentality, where as everything is all written out. She said, black life is dramatic. Y'all know that. She said, you know, when you see a brother walk down the street, he's got that walk. You know what I mean? We have perfected that walk. Y'all know what I'm talking about? That walk says, sister, look at me, there ain't no man better than me on the planet, and you know it. And each brother has his own personality walk bred into it. Brothers take time to get their walk together. Is that right? We call it stepping. You know what I mean? And sisters do not have to go to any school to have a book put on their head to know how to walk. Sisters just got that thing going. They know how to shake it and make it. And then they let you know you can't touch it. See how fine I am? Nobody fine. When Ray Charles sang about Georgia and they brought him down to this cracker state called Georgia, they didn't understand the joke was on him. Because he wasn't about to be singing about no state that hung black people. He was talking about some sister named Georgia. You hear me? So Zora said we're dramatic. Jacob Carruthers said African speech, meta nature, is dramatic speech. He called it a walking, talking, doing speech. Now here's the point I want to make. See, one of our big arguments about we lost our culture in slavery is we lost our language. And that is sure enough proof that we lost our culture. Dr. Theophil Obenga, who's a linguist, I am not. I was discussing this with him last year. You know, he's Dr. Cheikana Diop's best student. He and Dr. Jacob Carruthers are really the two best people on ancient Kemet in the world. Both of them. Dr. Jake from Chicago, little brother, heavy brother. And what he said is, just because you change a people's language doesn't mean that you really fundamentally change their culture, because their thought pattern continues. And Zora said, this was her conclusion, therefore, white people think in writing, black people think hieroglyphically. What does she mean by that? You know that meta nature, Jacob Carruthers makes a point, he said that when you see meta nature, it portrays what it is. So if they're talking about speech, you see a mouth. If we're talking about hearing, you see a ear. Smelling, a nose. And Zora was making the same point. And what she was saying was that our speech is action-oriented. Now, if you go to Gardner, who is one of the authorities on Egyptian language, he will show you the key difference between meta nature and English, between African language and English is this. There is a thing called the verbal sentence. And it's where the verb comes first. You know the rule in English sentence structure is the noun comes first. You hear me? Now guess what? When you read the black Ebonics specialists, and some of us are so brainwashed, we don't want anything to do with Ebonics. I don't know if y'all remember, a few years ago there was a battle around Ebonics. My friend, Brother Oscar Wright, who comes from Mississippi, who's a multimillionaire, lives in the heart of the black community, started this Ebonics debate, and he said, I know I come from Mississippi, and I don't speak English. And he wanted to get Ebonics recognized in the public schools so we could get some bilingual money. And you had Jesse Jackson running around talking about, y'all know I'm not an Ebonics speaker. As Ebonics as you can get. So what you find with black folks is this. The Ebonics specialists say the key difference between black language and white language is the verbal sentence. The sentence where the verb comes first. So you can change the language, but as Zora Neale Hurston said, because this English was too dead, it didn't fit our lips, we had to change it. You hear me? Zora says there's such a thing as the verbal noun. Think about this one. Well, we take a noun and turn it into a verb. I'll give you an example. White people will say they're going to go to a funeral to bury Mr. White. The Ebonics thinking African will say, we're going to funeralize Mr. Black. White people will say, we're going to vacuum the rug. I was in Britain and heard this saying from a Jamaican. They say, we're going to Hooverize the rug. We place the emphasis on action. Meta-nature hieroglyphic thinking means we're symbolic thinkers. Most of our psychologists say this, you know what I mean? And so we think in symbols. When you see a black preacher preach, what's he doing? He's becoming what he's speaking about. When you saw Richard Pryor do his comedy act, he was one of the two best comedians produced, along with Moms Mayer. But she was bad too. What did Richard Pryor do? He would mimic whoever he was making fun of. He would become that person. So this hieroglyphic mentality is fundamentally different from this purely rational mentality because it's based on a synthesis of reason and emotion, intuition and logic. And we need it now, because if you're going to teach kids in the public schools, or particularly in our own schools, we need to have symbolic forms of education so they can get more than one meaning to something. There's more than one way to solve a mathematical equation. There is more than one meaning to anything in life. We also need this meta-nature hieroglyphic mentality because, as the ancient Kemites said, speak truth, do truth. We gotta be the truth we speak. We gotta walk our talk. I'm here to tell you, some of us may say we didn't lose anything in Africa, but we have kept our African mind in spite of ourselves. You know what I'm telling you? Finally, I want to say this, because there are a lot of differences I could show you, but I just wanted to focus on a few. European philosophy and culture is rooted in chaos. I'm a philosopher. I study European, African, Asian, African American, The author of chaos theory comes from Hesiod. Jacob Carruthers notes that the founding European philosopher is a Greek sheep herder named Hesiod. He was illiterate. He was a poet. Now, we call that the oral tradition, but for white people, he was illiterate. But he founded their worldview. And so he also had this idea that came from the Greeks that the highest god was a god named Zeus. And Zeus, his quality was he did whatever he wanted to do. Nietzsche called this the will to power. But if you read Hesiod, the better term is arbitrary power or arbitrary freedom. I'm going to tell you something. Western culture is grounded in chaos, and it is grounded in the notion of arbitrary power and arbitrary freedom. They are getting ready to create chaos in the Middle East, and they don't care. And the reason why George Bush has not given you a reason for why he's going in there is that he believes that he has the authority to do it, and if he can do it, he has the right to do it. Some people ask, why did Hitler kill the Jews? You can talk about anti-Semitism. You can talk about what the Catholic Church did to them. You can talk about the ghetto. But the ultimate truth is they had the power and they did it. And that's what this Western culture rests upon. That's hard for us to understand. So we've got to understand also that Western culture, particularly the Western European nations and the U.S., profess democracy. Republican government, which isn't democracy. It's a few who are supposed to represent the many. But if you read Madison in the Federalist Papers, he tells you that American Republican government is for the purpose of government, I'm quoting him, to control the people. And then he said government would control itself. What a contradiction. You give a group of people all the power and then you expect them to check their own power. How crazy can you get? I'm here to tell you African culture, as you know, is based on a different premise. The universe did not come out of chaos. Too many African philosophers make the mistake of calling disorder chaos. Our notion of the universe is that the universe came out of Ma'at, harmony, truth, justice, balance, right order, uprightness, regularity, genuineness, reality. Reality is the ultimate meaning of Ma'at, the rudder of heaven and the beam of earth. It is the direction of the cosmos. When Ra emerges from the noon, he ingests Ma'at, meaning that God cannot be arbitrary. God must operate according to the truth. A brother did some good things for me. This happens with a lot of us, real good things. God, I've been working on my roof. for 8 hours when I first moved into my house about 10 years ago. 8 hours. And I said, Joe, what do I owe you? He says, I'll get mine. What goes around comes around. He said, I'll be rewarded for this. Black people believe that there's a law in the cosmos, that you get what you give. You understand? If you read the slave narratives, the most important thing a slave mother will say to her child isn't become rich, it'll become free and be good. Be good. The most important thing your parents say about you is you're a good child. Isn't that right? Some are rotten as all hell, but they'll find some good in them too. Isn't that the truth? But the thing is, if we look at African culture gave birth to democracy. These little people called the C.O.R.E, they gave birth to the most just societies in the world, where all the men and women were equally empowered to govern society, where the people were the government and there was no government to control the people because the people were in charge. And I'm here to tell you, black people in America are more C.O.R.E-like than anything else because we hate any restrictions being imposed on us, especially unjust ones. Am I telling the truth? African Americans carried this inheritance of democracy to the plantation, and this is one of the ways we recreated African culture. One slave narrative put it this way. A slave said, when we created spirituals, we would think of a tune from Africa. And then he'd say, I'm quoting, we would create a song on the spur of the moment. On the spur of the moment. Dizzy Gillespie said that improvisation is based on 4 contradictory principles. One is discipline and freedom. We do not have the idea of arbitrary freedom because we believe that you must be disciplined before you can exercise freedom. If you're a jazz musician, you have to be disciplined to play your horn. If you're an organizer, you have to be disciplined to listen to the people. If you're a George Washington Carver, you have to be disciplined to master the fundamentals of chemistry. You understand? You don't have the freedom to just do any old thing. And he said the second thing our tradition is based on is spontaneous organization. I'm telling you, Dizzy was heavy. Spontaneous organization. When the brothers said we created this music on the spur of the moment, he was describing spontaneity that's organized. Anytime you see a jazz combo start to put something together, Miles was the best example. He'd go into a recording studio with about 3 notes, and then he'd say to all the musicians, start with what you know and go beyond yourself. You know, with that gruffy voice he had. And they would suddenly create new music on the spot. If you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, it was creating a movement on the spur of the moment through spontaneous organization. If you look at the Garvey movement, it was again creating a movement on the spur of the moment. Improvisation is the most essential part of African American culture. To put it another way, creativity is the soul of African American culture. Am I telling the truth? So we had to improvise to recreate African culture in America. My great-grandmother, all your mothers and great-grandmothers did this, was very poor. She raised a large household, my mother and a whole bunch of brothers and sisters. And they'd look into that cupboard, and they would look into that refrigerator, and there was really no food. And she would go into that pantry, and she would put her a pot up. And when she got through with this pot, she had a concoction that really tasted good. And she called it slop gully. Now, if she had called it slop, they wouldn't have eaten it. But the gullion made it sound good. It was better than McDonald's or Burger King. When you see a sister or brother go into the kitchen and begin to take that stuff and put it together, that's that improvising where we don't make the same meal 2 times. I'm telling you, this is the soul of African people, and it is the heart of our democracy. So I want to conclude by saying this. We got to go black to the future. We got to go back to black. We've got to respect our ancient African past, but we've also got to respect the derivative of it, which is this rich African American past. There is nothing more beautiful in this culture, in the world, this side of heaven than the souls of black folks. When you see the black folks in South Africa, when they were struggling against the odds they were struggling against, and it seemed like there was no hope, and they're still oppressed, you could hear those shouts and those cries, because we dance and we sing in everything we do. And you could say the souls of our people are too strong to crush. We have got to value this culture. We have got to cultivate this culture. We've got to wade in the water. As the Christians are born again through baptism, we got to be baptized in the water of African and African American culture deeply and permanently, constantly and continuously, because awakening is a continuous experience. And at any point you say, I'm fully awake and I know everything, you're about ready to backslide. You hear me? We need to take this vision of this beautiful culture and begin to construct a vision of a just society. El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, who this dinner is an honor of, he met with the minister of Ghana in the middle 60s, and he made this comment. He said, this minister said that freedom was the ability of a people to get to a point where they could do what they wanted to do. And then Malcolm said, it's the African-American musician who has demonstrated the greatest amount of freedom in this country. And he said, this African-American musician without sheet music will come up with the new music. And Malcolm said, I can see a day when black people will go inside their souls and we will create a new philosophy. He said, I see a day when we can go inside our souls and we'll create a new economy. He said, I see when we can go inside our souls and create new family systems and a new society. We have that challenge. This beautiful culture has got to give us the vision to reshape a place as crooked as a pretzel and turn it straight. A place that is upside down and turn it right side up, so that Ma'at will shine and so that the ancestors of Africa will smile. Hotel. Give it up for Dr. Haiba Sonyika. Immediately following the services, we'll have an election.